Hi, welcome to the bathtub. It's the old masturbator, Scott Bradfield. You know who I am. You know what's going on here. This is the special. We have the special edition of the bathtub with no pixels. We have no high tech. We got rid of all the tech years ago. We're all low tech. We're totally low tech here. We have no sound equipment. This is the most sound equipment we got. I had to buy a speaker because the speaker on these apples suck, and I got that. That's it. That's the only tech we have in the whole house, and this is run by a small hamster, which is actually running that thing for you. And we have no there's no, it's unpixelated water. There's no alcohol. There's no substitutes. There's nothing in it. You can take no substitutes except no substitutes. It's pure mountain water. Cruel light of day, and no fonts. We never use font. Look at all these other YouTubers, these with their fancy fonts. We don't even know what a font is. We couldn't find a font. If you spilled them all over my room, I wouldn't know where the fonts were. So we're just here to talk about books that I've reread with pleasure. Now, these are not writers I reread with pleasure the most. For example, if we were talking about just writers I reread with pleasure the most, probably we've talked about them a lot. George Simenon, Brian Moore's, a couple of my favorites, Richard Yates. I've read I've read dozens and dozens of Simenon books, but not a specific book that I always go back to and every few years and just enjoy just as much. Just stacked up here, no particular order, but they're all books I've read many times, and I'm planning to read again. That's the most important part, because I'm planning to live for a long time. Maupassant. So Maupassant, this is a trick. This is kind of a trick question because, like Chekhov, there's just lots of different editions of Maupassant, and basically there's a lot of the same stories keep showing up over and over again. I've read many of his stories at least 5 or 6 times, which is kind of the cutoff point for the books we put on this list. And every edition I get of his, I don't care who translated it. I love it. I just love reading Maupassant. We talked about Fitzgerald, my favorite novel, Tender as the Night, one of the most beautifully written American novels ever written. Just a beautiful, beautiful, sad, lovely book. And I love his short stories, too. I came to them late. As a young man, I read Hemingway and all the stuff you're supposed to read. And it took me a long time. I didn't get into Fitzgerald until I was pretty much an older man, in my 40s probably. And I think Richard Yates got me to really give Fitzgerald more of a try. Because I said this in the last episode, I always found Great Gatsby a little boring. Maybe because people kept talking about how great it was, and I was a little it's a good book. I'm not saying it's not a wonderful book and has some great stuff in it. It's just not my favorite book of Fitzgerald. His short stories are wonderful. And this is probably the collection. I like single author collections as a sort of retrospective collection. I think he published in his lifetime. Has so many wonderful stories, including the story of Babylon Revisited and Winter Dreams, The Diamond as Big as the Ritz. And I've read this book at least 5 or 6 times. This is a wonderful book of stories. If you haven't tried him before, try him again with that collection. We've talked about it. Orwell's one of my favorite rereading. I reread Orwell's essays and his nonfiction books over and over and over again. I always hated 1984. I never really got into 1984 until a few years ago when I had to teach it to some high school. Not teach it, help some kids understand it. I was like tutoring some kids in a high school. And I didn't realize how funny it was. I must have read it 5 or 6 times just in that period I was tutoring. And it's a really funny book. We did an episode on on the funny parts of it. It's way back there in the golden age of the bathtub. Back when we had the whiteboard. Back before the war. Which one of the wars. Speaking of short stories, here's a book I've reread many times. Sometimes I reread them because I assign books I love to my classes over the years. I've read the stories of Raymond Carver. This is the first 3. This is the Great British Edition. We've talked about it before. It's his first 3 collections. It's got the first 3 collections: Will You Be Quiet, Please, What We Talk About When We Talk About Love, and Cathedral, in this beautiful Picador edition, all in one copy. And I must have read this book over and over again with great affection and great pleasure. In fact, that reminds me of the Tobias Wolff volume I have up here somewhere. I got to put that on this list too. Okay, the book I've probably reread the most. I don't like it the most, but I do love the book. But I've reread the most in my lifetime has got to be Lolita. This is the kind of cool annotated up. It's an annotated edition by Alfred. Who's the guy's name? Alfred Apple Jr. Anyway, which I used to get because when I was teaching it, I couldn't. I would teach. I taught this book almost every year. I used to teach a modern novel course at University of Connecticut. It was one of the few classes I always look forward to teaching. I always do different books every year. Every course I taught, I always taught Lolita as the first book. And a lot of people found it upsetting. And it's become more difficult to teach over the years. I read this first when I was 15 or 16. Loved it. Didn't get any of the stuff. Nabokuki, we call him Nabokuki at the bathtub, that he puts into the book, and the density and the references to all these books that he loves, and the complications of reading it. We've talked about Lolita in way back in the dawn of time of this stupid show. I read this book every year, at least for 20 years when I was teaching. I'd read it 2 or 3 times before that. I haven't read it in quite a long time, but I will go back and reread Lolita. It is one of the great, beautiful books. Just like there's 3 books in here which I have reread over and over of Nabokov's. Palefire. Again, I read it when I was young and didn't quite get it. And in the past 20 years, I taught it once or twice. We've done several episodes on it here at the bathtub. It's the most complicated book here in the list of books I've reread, but I do love it, have read it, and will read it again. We've talked about it also. The other Nabokov I love reading, and it's the one I give to people who don't think they're going to like him, is Laughter in the Dark. It's a very, very funny book. It totally wraps you up. I find a lot of Nabokov a little hard to crack sometimes. It's a little too clever, a little too manipulative in its way. But this is just a textbook good story. And the central character, the woman who just takes this jerk apart, it's very funny. It's a very funny book. Okay, 2 more. We've done episodes on these, but books I've reread. We've talked about this Violin. We did 3 or 4 episodes on one of my favorite novels. I've never really liked Pynchon's early books. I've read them and reread them and sometimes taught them with not a great deal of pleasure. I find his prose in his early books really hard to follow. I picked up Violin when it came out, thinking I would hate it. Picked it up, couldn't put it down. It is one of my favorite novels, just beautifully written novel. His prose just totally sings through this thing. And it's all about the Reagan years and about all the people, all the ideals and concepts that Pynchon loved about kind of radical 70s Americans just selling out to the Reagan years. And it's basically a very prescient book about how those bastards took over our country. It's a very funny book. It's very beautifully written. It's a very affectionate book for all the characters. Which brings me to Inherent Vice, another book. I bought this when it came out because I thought, okay, this guy's learning how to write. I bought this when it came out. A few books I bought as soon as it came out. I think it came out at Christmas, 2009. Anyway, I could look it up, but I'm not going to. And I've read it 4 or 5 times since then. I taught it once. It's another one that just sings, and it's just a beautiful piece of writing about Southern California. I have never seen. Everyone's always asking me if I've seen the P.T. Anderson movie. I just don't. It's one of those books I love so much, and I don't like Joaquin Phoenix. I find him boring. I don't dislike him. I just find him a little boring. I just haven't gotten to the movie, and I don't think I will. Those are 2 wonderful books. Speaking of Southern California, here's a book I've read. I read this first when I was probably 15 when this edition came out. There's those beautiful Ballantine covers, man. This was a beautiful set. I still have all that whole set that they brought out in the 60s. The Long Goodbye, his second to last complete novel. They made a very good movie with Elliot Gould. But this is another one of those books. Every 10 years I pick it up, and it's just one of those beautifully written books. I like Chandler. I like The Big Sleep. It's okay. There's some good stuff in it. I like his earlier stuff. But in this and in The Little Sister, his prose it's like watching Pynchon in those books. It just flies. He learns it all. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful piece of prose writing about Southern California. I can't recommend it enough. Every 8 or 10 years I pick it up and I enjoy it just as much. A lot of the books you reread, they just aren't as pleasurable, but that one, over and over again, I love that book. Again, Graham Greene, there's not a single, I'm kind of breaking my rule here, because there's not a single Graham Greene. I've reread the most is Our Man in Havana, because I often teach it. I've read it 10 or 12 times, and it's a wonderful book. But my favorite is probably The Human Factor. But he is one of those writers, I should probably do a whole other episode on just the writers I reread the most. And he would definitely make that list. There's not a single book of his that I would go back to again and again. This is a book I go back to again and again, and a writer. So a book that I've reread since I first read it when I was like 18. Every Richard Yates novel and every short story of his is beautiful and beautifully written and just still moving and so powerful. Like Brian Moore, these are the two writers that most affected me in my lifetime. Revolutionary Road, that's the copy I found at a little bookshop in the Richmond district of San Francisco when I lived there, and I was like 19. I lived next to Avram Davidson. There was a bunch of little cool bookstores nearby, and I bought this brand new, and I only bought it because it had this quote on the back by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. And when I interviewed Richard Yates, he says this was the best quote he ever got on a book. It says, "The Great Gatsby of my time, Kurt Vonnegut Jr." And it seemed like such a weird conjunction of Kurt Vonnegut and The Great Gatsby. I thought, well, I'll try it. It's unlike any other book you've read. It's a wonderful, wonderful novel about people in America who just have nowhere, who have a lot of desires for something beautiful in their lives and who can't find it anywhere around them. Anyway, that's one of the great novels. You got to read it. Finally, I think this is the last one. Oh, I know there's one or two more I forgot to bring up here. I looked at all. I started rereading a lot of the comics I read as a kid, and those are okay. They're kind of fun. I told you we did the Legion of Superheroes, which are a little tedious sometimes when I reread them. But for some reason, these Jack Kirby books from the 70s, from the mid-70s, when he did the Fourth World Omnibus, I've written about this and talked about it on the show, in the bathtub. And that period he did for DC, they're completely crazy. They're kind of weird comics, but they're just fun to read. I really enjoy. I've read the Fourth World Omnibuses many times. I read the comics when they came out, and I still get a kick out of those comics, including the Demon. Commandi's another favorite of people's, but I kind of prefer the Demon and Mr. Miracle. Anyway, those are some of the greats. And the one I didn't mention that I've reread the most. Can I find it? Oh yeah, here it is. Hold on. What if I fall down? There we go. We plan everything. This is like a finely tuned military drill when we do this show. William Gaz's Jr. Again, I'm not, and this is not my favorite of all the books. I would put all these together. I can't really say which is favorite, but I have read this 6 or 8 times. I laugh my ass off when I read this book, and I someday would like to read it again. We'll see. Anyway, there's two episodes, basically just masturbating about books I personally love rereading. Don't read them or reread them unless you feel like it, but watch out for flying objects or whatever you're supposed to watch out for. Stay safe. Masturbate freely. And if anyone gives you any trouble, you send them to me. Okay? Take care. Bye.